Whenever people ask me what kind of map they need for their D&D campaign, I always pause, because the answer really is whatever map you need for your campaign. You know, it's not a realm map, it's not a world map, it's not a city map, it's not a dungeon map, it's just whatever you need for the next session. And that could mean that you only require, you know, a very crude pencil map. It could mean that you need something fully illustrated that you can give to your players. Your needs will vary depending on where you are in your campaign, and you as a DM can respond to that. There is no right or wrong answer, it's what you're preparing. So in today's video, I'm going to walk you through the process by which I mapped my world. And I'm not talking about a single map, I'm talking about early sketches towards the end when I made much more specific adventure-focused maps. When I learned to use, you know, colored ink and watercolors and paints and weathering properly. So how I went from that to this so that you can do it for your own world. Because each map was a specific tool for a specific purpose. And when you think of it in that way, it becomes a much less daunting task. You don't necessarily need to have the compendium that I do. All you need to do is be aware of what you need for your world. So, let's get into it. Hello adventurers and welcome back to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan and today we are discussing what maps you need for your fantasy world. So today's video is a bit more of a discussion rather than a tutorial, and it's for a specific reason. I know that everyone is keen for another update on how the Atlas is going, and I will get there eventually, but I've been a little bit delayed, but it's for, again, a specific reason. Because as I was working on the latest update for the Atlas, talking about, you know, how I can add in capital cities and regions, I got an email from the team over at Legendkeeper who had watched the original Atlas video. And they were very nice, they loved what I was doing, and they told me about what they're working on. So Legendkeeper, which is their software, is kind of like a wiki for your own game, which first of all suits me right down to the ground. And they talked about it as being a possible platform for an online Atlas. A real explorable interactive wiki of all of the details that I have made for my own world. And they said, hey, use it if you want, just, you know, if you'd like it, talk about it. So I used it a lot. So far, I've sunk about 24 hours into it, which is rather a lot of time. And it was the time that I was supposed to be working on the next Atlas video and the next updated versions of the Atlas. And on the plus side, I now have several hundred pages on the wiki that are, you know, interconnected and networked together. And I figured out how to use the maps properly, and I've got ideas for how to upload quests and use notice boards and include like world building clues. And I've been slowly adding in all of the details of my own world that I've gathered up over the years. So because of that, this week I don't have a major update for the Atlas. And I know that that's disappointing, but I do have the live video. The downloadable for the map of that will be available on my Patreon very, very soon. I will also have all the maps that I discuss in this tutorial on the Patreon as well. And in addition, I have the latest version of the Atlas. There are some updates, as well as the link to the wiki for the Kingdom of Endon, the basis for the Atlas that I'm working on. The idea being that all the work that I've currently put into it, you know, fleshing out ideas, seeing how things can be interconnected, working out how I can create an Atlas on that platform that is interactive and explorable, can be used by you. So I can talk about that in the next video, which is coming up. So if you're interested in the work that I've done on my world, the link is below. If you want to check out Legendkeeper for your own uses, I have an affiliate link in the description below, so you can check that out as well. But in the meantime, let's get back to the tutorial. Now, the first ever map that I made for my world was a lot more crude than the ones I currently use. First of all, it was A4 and on printed paper, so it's much, much smaller than the ones that I use now. But, you know, it had, you know, block shading on the mountains. The trees were kind of little wiggly symbols. The towns were, you know, messily labeled. It was a bit of a mess, but I look back on it with fondness. This is the version that I originally gave to my players. As you can see, it's been a little bit loved, it's been a little bit used, and it served its purpose when I originally made it. This was the basis for which I planned out my campaign. And that's all I needed, because I only planned to run for 10 or so sessions. Because it worked. It gave me somewhere to place the starting town, somewhere else for the players to go next, and that's all it really needed. The players saw the map during the first session and they did instantly have questions. They had a quest to go on, to go to Sunderking's Barrow nearby, a starting town in Shallowport, and an idea of where people were coming from and going to. But suddenly, because they had questions, I had answers for them, and that was what allowed me to start planning out a much larger campaign. But it wasn't the only map that I initially made. I actually made 3 maps for the first campaign. The first was this map of the kingdom, because I wanted an idea of what was around. They weren't going to go very far. I didn't need a world map. But this was good enough for that. But I needed a starting town. So I made this map of Shallowport, which is also, by my modern standards, a little bit crude and stylized and not very tidy. But for the purposes of that initial session, this 12 centimeter by 16 centimeter map was all I really needed. It had the locations that they were going to explore. It had the names of taverns and inns as they went in, because I hadn't actually named them yet. And I attached it to this, piece of paper that had a bit of the history of the town and an understanding of what the aesthetics of it were and who was in the town and what the quests could be. It was a very quick sketch. It was just an idea of what it was like in the area so that I could improvise off it. It was a map that taught me much more about the practical game prep than any fantasy cartography guide I've ever read. Because it was useful. It grounded the players. I had 2 versions. I had this version and one that I gave to them that I weathered. It let them make informed decisions. It gave their choices some contexts. And because you don't really need a pretty map for Dungeons & Dragons. Weathering a map like this is more than enough for them. They can make notes on it. They did make notes on it. In fact, they used it so much that it actually got ripped and broken a few months later, stained by coffee and tea and various Cheeto fingerprints. And from there, I moved on to the 3rd map that I made for the first session, which was a dungeon map. I had 3 kind of locational contexts. A big one, which was the Kingdom of Endon, a more local one, which was the town. It allowed them to do role-playing and exploring and puzzle solving, and then the dungeon. The dungeon dive is just an essential part of D&D, especially if you're starting out. And I used, the 5-chamber system that I've talked about in other videos, and made Sunderking's Barrow, which is very nearby to the town of Shallowport. And it was less of a map and more of a planning session for me. I used the opportunity to give it like an overlay to cement in my mind what it was like to enter it, what the ambience was of it, who they were going to encounter, what the riddles were going to be, what the puzzles were, and labeled everything so that I could just pull it out and use it. I wouldn't need to write notes down. It was just a visual aid for me, and it worked out really, really well in that way. So well that just became the norm for upcoming sessions. Every session I would go in and I would make a new dungeon dive or 2 so that they could have choices of where they go. I made up a backlog of all of these different dungeons with prompts for the adventures and the encounters that they could have, how they were connected to the outer world. And that became the process by which I began to flesh out the world. I had this map of the kingdom, and every couple of sessions I'd add a new town map, which took me, an hour or 2. But every session I would add 1 or 2 new dungeons in. And over time, we went through 10 sessions. And at the end, I had about 20 or so dungeons and 10 city maps and the map of the Kingdom of Endon. And that was really more than enough of an understanding of the world for me to then take it one step further. Because it was before that point, before I had that store, before we finished the first arc of my D&D campaign, that they started asking questions about the wider world. And that's very fair, because the Kingdom of Endon map was not very complicated, and I made it pretty clear you could cover the kingdom on horseback in like 4 days. So they asked questions about what the wider world looked like. And as I've discussed in previous videos, I didn't think it was necessary to make a full world map. So I just made a map of an area of roughly the size of Europe so that they could meet people who'd come on long journeys, but I wouldn't need to flesh out the lore of the entire world. So I did a pencil sketch of the lands of the Greenlit Sea. And that was the basis for me kind of understanding how everything, fits together. And you can see that stylistically, it's almost exactly the same as that map of the Kingdom of Endon. The trees are, little blocky pencils, symbols, and the towns are, very messily labeled. And I quite like it. but it wasn't nearly as tidy or good looking as the later versions. So I took that pencil sketch and that became my reference, and I made this inked version of the map that I could then give to them. And I did. But the problem was, of course, that they then started having more and more questions. They finished the first arc of the campaign after 10 sessions. They defeated the bad guy, who was the king of the Kingdom of Endon, and they started wanting to venture out further and further into the world. And so I took that pencil sketch and that ink map of the map of the Greenlit Sea, and I decided to make 2 new maps. And I devoted hours and hours and hours to it. Before, the maps had only taken me a couple of hours at a time. But I decided to sit down and give them something that they would really be able to sink their teeth into, that they would love the style of. So I made this map of the Kingdom of Endon. It's up there on my wall right now. It's been in pride of place for years now. I made that, 4.5 years ago, and it's been sitting on my wall ever since. It's not the only map I've made since then of the kingdom, but it certainly has a special place in my heart. It's very good looking, it's tidily labeled, it's got a lot more colors, and it's certainly much, much bigger than the A4 map, but it still has a few problems to it. You can see that, again, that the labels aren't very tidy. I've put dark labels over dark symbols. I haven't left gaps for the reading of words. There's a lot of messiness, especially around the center of the map, and it loses its coherence towards the borders, and that's all fine because it served its purpose. When I first rolled it out onto the table and the players poured over it and they started writing in their own symbols and figuring out where things were going and measuring distances in that way, it was amazing in a way that the A4 map hadn't been. But that wouldn't have been possible or usable for that first 10 sessions. I didn't need it then. It was only when they started doing quests that required them to move very quickly from one side of the kingdom out to the other that became really usable. But at the same time, they started asking questions about the world as a whole. I did another map, a map of the lands of the Greenlit Sea, just much larger than the previous versions. And this was the map, the first real map that I was happy with the style of. It was tidy, it was clean lined, it was all in ink, and I've got to say, it was one of the most beautiful maps I have ever done. I'm still so pleased with it. I've given copies to all of my players. They've got them hanging up at home. They use them to plan all the time. It's fantastic. But that map at the time was a bit of a gamble for me because they hadn't left the kingdom at this point. And in fact, they didn't leave the kingdom for a solid, year and a half after the point at which I made the map. So until that point, it was really just world building for them. It was just decoration. It wasn't usable. It wasn't a tool. It didn't have a purpose. It was a gamble of a lot of time because it took me about 12 hours to make that map. It took me a great deal of time. And so it's worth you knowing that when you create maps like this, if you're not creating them for a specific purpose, if you're just making them because you want to flesh out the world building and have something of your own, then that's fine. That's great. But it might just be that you never really use it. And if you're okay with that, you're okay with that. But consider the process, the timeline of maps that I've created as I've gone on here and how your needs fit into which one of these maps we've got going on. So now we were about 2 years in, about 30 sessions, which is fewer than I'd hoped, but because of lockdowns and COVID and things like that, we were moving apace now. We were starting to pick up speed, and my players fell to the Underdark, which is annoying because it's not on the map. It's not on either of the maps. So I needed to make an entirely new regional map, and I did. I used the things that I'd learned from making the map of the Greenlit Sea, and I made something that looked good and tidy and was evocative of the different places within the Underdark. And I used it in the same way that I made a lot of the maps of the various dungeons. Creating the map was the opportunity for me to do a lot of world building for this entirely new area. As I sketched it out and I made different symbols and I explored different areas, gave me the chance to kind of figure out who lived where and what their relationships were and what it would be like to be on the ground in each of these different areas, and as well as adding in different world building points. It wasn't the only map of the Underdark that I made. In fact, I made another one about a year ago, but it was what they needed at the time. And that was the beginning of making these sort of area-specific maps. Since that point, it's just been more and more and more. From then, I mean, I continued to make new town maps and city maps and dungeon maps as they went further and further and further into the Underdark. But it also began this trend of making site-specific maps as they ventured into these places that I made in the Underdark map, and they wanted to start planning, you know, heists and attacking castles and exploring ruins and figuring out puzzles and quests on a much, much grander scale. Because by the time they exited the Underdark, we were about session 50 or so. And now they were in the old overworld. And they started moving out further and further, and I started adding more and more to the pile. So I had a map of the kingdom, a map of the continent, a pile of 20 or 30 different towns, a map of the Underdark, about 25 individual sites, and about 40 or 50 dungeons at this point. I made fewer and fewer dungeons as we went on. The Underdark's just one big dungeon anyway. And I really needed a way to codify them, to sort them all together, to kind of bind them in this way of sort of organization that made sense, that I could go back and find the various things that I needed to find. And so I started having to write excerpts and descriptions and, you know, quest leads for each of the towns and dungeons so that when I came back to them, I could remember what I'd made them for. And it became this sort of first draft of what would eventually become the Atlas. I still have that original copy. I gave it to one of my players as a reward for finalizing a quest. And that's not to say that it hasn't changed since then, or that I haven't added to it, but that was the process. From going from this, you know, pretty simple sketch of the Kingdom of Endon to this first draft of the Atlas that would eventually become this map-making channel. Because it wasn't long after that point that a friend of mine looked at all the various maps that I had on my walls and the various, you know, excerpts for the Atlas and the piles and piles of all these sketches and drawings and said to me, hey, I want to make a map of my fantasy world. Can you teach me what you've learned? And I said, yeah, okay, I'll make a tutorial video. And then I made another one and another one. And over the course of the last 18 months, as I've been adding to these tutorials, you've seen my style change and grow and learn. I started using more paints and more inks. I started experimenting with weathering and coding and giving more details. And I started exploring, you know, naturalists maps and puzzle maps and location-specific maps in a way that I hadn't done before. And that is how we got from there to here. But all of that, all of this started with one scruffy A4, messy, very tea-stained map of the Kingdom of Endon. And that's all you need to start. Just take it one step at a time. That's my advice. So if you're starting your own D&D world and you're wondering where to begin, that is the process by which I explored my world. Don't think of it as starting your mapping with this. Start your maps with something like this and then take it step by step by step. I'm now 120 sessions in the main campaign of my world and many more side quests and other campaigns in it. I've had more than enough time to explore and flesh out and world build using the various charts and maps that I have. But it took me 5 years to get to this point. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon, so get ready for the long haul. If you have questions about it, again, I'm covering about 5 years in the space of 20 minutes. Please stick them in the comments below. I'm happy to chat more about it in the future. Don't be too mad at me that I've put off the Atlas. I promise the next update will be worth the wait. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon and my YouTube members. It's fantastic to have you. And as always, if you want to chat more, you can check out the Red Quills Discord. We talk about map making and world building and the, you know, drawing techniques that I talk about in the tutorials all the time. I'm always happy to chat there as well. Feel free to tag me. So I'm going to leave it there for today. What do you think of this tutorial? Was it useful for you? Was it interesting to listen to? Do you want to know more about the process of how I got from there to hear? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, I'll see you next week. In this particular arc, we're going to be studying how different ancient civilizations mapped their understanding of the world and how we can use them for D&D. I'm very, very excited. We are starting next week with a map in the ancient Egyptian style based on the Book of the Dead. So I'll see you then. So in today's video, I'm going to walk you through the process by which I mapped my world. Hang on a second. Do you mind?